intelligencesquared.com.
Thank you, Marcus. It's a funny sort of motion, this one. I have to say, usually when someone asks me to speak in a debate, I understand the motion, and I know what would happen in the world if one side of the motion prevailed and the other one didn't. I rather came along hoping that the three previous speakers would tell me what the motion was about, and I'd know how to address it, and in many ways they have. But one could almost take this motion to an absurdity, that it means that Britain shouldn't talk to China about what's going on in the world, which is clearly, at that point, the motion simply becomes a truism. Or to argue on the other way round, that Britain can abandon any thought of policies at home and can just rely on other countries, which makes it just a case that can't be argued at all. So having said that, I will passionately argue against the case made by the proposers of the motion, not least because I was told that if I don't, I can't claim the fee for the evening. So the first thing I think to say broadly is, and this was the whole debate about the clean development mechanism at Kyoto in 1997, there is actually quite a lot of intellectual stuff behind the idea that you put your resources to where they're going to have the largest short-term effect on emissions reductions. Europe's carbon emissions over the course of the last 20 years have actually been falling, if you take Eurasia as a whole. North America, they've been edging up. The Asia-Pacific region, they have more than doubled. In China, they have more than tripled. And so, in one case, in terms of the actual levels of energy efficiency, but also because it obviously is more efficient to introduce the most efficient technology either at the point that you are expanding or at the point you're replacing because of the natural end of life, then you're going to get a better outcome than if you close plant down early and replace it with more energy efficient and climate efficient technologies to meet short-term targets. So I don't think the debate is about that. I think that's fairly straightforward economics. But I think there are three difficulties with the broad approach which has been taken, I think, in the motion here. One of them, broadly here, if we are talking about clean development mechanism, the problem always was verification. A whole string of schemes in China were cancelled, and then new schemes appeared where the plant was 2 or 3 metres to the left, or it had an extra valve in it or something for a multi-million pound scheme, so it could qualify for carbon credits. And I think that's an issue which we ought to work out if we are moving towards a global scheme on climate change. But I think the other two are perhaps rather more challenging and rather more interesting. Firstly, the issue of sustainability. I have to say, I don't believe that you can have a sustainable climate policy without it being a sustainable policy in other areas. But nor do I believe that the only thing there is to sustainability is economics. For a long time now, it's been accepted that there are three planks to sustainability. There certainly is the economics, and you may include technological issues within that. There are environmental issues, and they may include resource issues within that. But there is also the social and political dimension to sustainability. And if we fall for the idea that it's all about economics, we risk stripping out the whole point of this, which is the social effect that this has on our current generations, and particularly on the generations that are just around the corner. And the first thing to say about sustainability, of course, from a purely British point of view, is that most of the policies that make sense in climate change also make sense in the other realms of sustainability. They make sense in terms of the economics of becoming completely dependent on imported fossil fuels, as the UK is moving towards. And they also make sense in terms of the social disruption that will be associated with policies that aren't sustainable in terms of security of supply, as well as the social disruption that may be associated with climate change. So that first point is that most of these policies around climate change are not just about climate change and are very much issues for the governments of the United Kingdom. But the second issue, and I touched on it briefly in my bookshy 2 minutes earlier on, is that the world has had a string of occasions where things look like China looks at the moment, very rapidly developing economy, extremely exciting technologically, but they never seem to work out quite as simply as that. We need enthusiasts to get anything going, but it's in the nature of enthusiasts that they tend to over-egg the pudding. We saw it in the early days of the nuclear power industry. We saw it with 12-tone serialism in music. We saw it with the Social Democratic Party, if anyone remembers that, breaking the mould of British politics. I think, and China may prove to be an exception, but in my view, what is very, very different between the state that we are in the United Kingdom and China, which leaves us really with at this moment, the necessity to be leading on much of this, is that socially and politically, the United Kingdom, I think this was seen in the UK response to Fukushima. We've been through the three phases. The first one, where the public trusted industry and trusted politicians, and industry and politicians weren't fully up to that trust. The second phase, where people started to believe the anti-movement and they started to believe the green movement. And then the third phase, where we are now, where people have twigged that the green movement is just as likely to lie or to get things wrong as industry and politicians are. And there's now a much more healthy scepticism towards all those. My good friend George maybe has followed that path in his personal career over the course of the last couple of years, and full power to him for doing that. My impression is that the politics and the social arrangement of a number of countries, and China being an obvious case, is still broadly at that first stage. And whether that's imposed through military threats or whatever, I believe China has in front of it that second phase. Now, that second phase was enormously damaging, ultimately, to our fight against climate change as much as anything else. The main reasons why we're not better in the challenging climate change is because of the massive protests against low-carbon technologies, most notably nuclear power, but also it's very difficult to get permission for wind farms and for a number of others. Getting that social phase wrong is a massive gap in your move towards sustainability. And I believe that the United Kingdom and countries that have moved through this, and sadly not all of Europe has, is in a position to at least say there are ways through that. Industry has to be honest right from the start in a way that it wasn't in the United Kingdom, if we're going to move forward on that area. But I think to be too reliant on China being able to take the lead, socially and politically, would, I think, be an enormous mistake, when I believe that the developed democracies probably are in that position. But finally, I believe there is a moral case around this as well. I hate using the word moral and arguments because it implies that I think the proposed the motion are immoral, and I certainly don't. I think we're all motivated by a belief that climate change is enormously damaging, and by a belief that future generations need us to get it right if their lives are going to be sustainable. I do find it, though, extraordinary, this argument that what the United Kingdom does doesn't matter terribly much. Because, as George says, the important point is not that we're only a small proportion of the world's population, it's that we have an extraordinarily high carbon footprint, not only by global averages, which is bad enough now, but compared to where the world has to be to reach that sustainability. And there's a real danger if we fall down this route, we give the space to the political establishment to say we don't have to do anything in the UK, and if we did, it doesn't matter. Because the fact of the matter is we are spending our children's necessities on our luxuries today. We're spending their money with the debt that we're building up. We're spending their resources by using resources that have other very valuable uses for inefficient energy industries today. And we're using their climate as a dumping ground for the effects of these qualities of life, of these issues that we have today. We may be able to gain 10 more years of that unsustainability by relying on China to take the strain. All that would do would be to give another generation being brought up of believing that this sort of life is sustainable, or indeed ultimately the life that we should be leaving. We need to move now, I believe, on this. And the sooner that we get to that position of rewriting our relationship with the planet, and it's as dramatic as that, the better. And I do believe ultimately that that argument has to start at home and not on the other side of the world.
Thank you, Malcolm. Vicky and Simon? Simon, questions?
Oh yeah, another one of those questions. Yeah. So two parts again. First, I just want to deal with this sort of the myth of China proposition that you're putting forward. So China has just completed the world's largest green stimulus program of over $200 billion. Between now and 2015, it will spend $450 billion on environmental protection. It will spend near on $500 billion on renewables development and $600 billion on smart grids. There will be problems. Things will go wrong. There will be more train crashes. There is no question about that. But let's not fool around with the idea that this isn't real. That's number one. It's just ridiculous. And number two, no one is arguing that what the UK does doesn't matter. What we're arguing is that it's in large part their economic policy which counts. European and North American protectionism will, George, be part of what prevents China decarbonising. Yeah, and UK is part of that process. Political capture by the financial sector here is part and parcel of what has undermined the public investment programme here. And that will, in turn, make it more difficult for China to progress. That, of course, the UK, Europe and the US has to do stuff, but it's about their economic policy and avoiding and moving away from the political capture that is making it hard for them to take advantage of where China is going that counts. I think that was a question.
Yeah. I mean, I'll come back to it. You may be right about China, but firstly, what you have just said, if you move back, 3 days, you would have plans in the United Kingdom which have subsequently been cancelled, as you referred to yourself. I think this faith that the future is always going to plan out the way that the enthusiasts today think it is going to is dangerous at the end of the day. It might happen, and I hope it does, but when the Chinese bottle of public protest finally comes out of the genie finally comes out of the bottle, we just don't know where that's going to take. I came across a Telegraph article recently which said of the hundreds of public protests in China, most of them were it's actually about landlords. But goodness me, I wouldn't automatically have thought of hundreds of public protests in China 2 or 3 years ago. And that's the difficulty. It's not that it might not go the way the enthusiasts want, because I hope it does, but where do we leave ourselves if we let our whole policy on climate change begin in Beijing? George, by the way, I don't like to argue against someone on my side, but don't make it difficult for us. We don't have to prove that our policy begins and ends in London. We just have to show it doesn't begin in Beijing. And I think to rely too much on that and say that's where it all goes on, I think is a mistake. But of course, your other point, I entirely agree. I'm not saying we turn our back on these countries or that China is not going to be dramatically more important in the long run. It's how we play our part in making sure that we help China, and that doesn't involve abrogating our responsibilities.
Thank you so much, Malcolm.